March 14, 1996. Harold Dietrich was 54 years old when he walked into Kemper Implements in Waterloo, Iowa, and told the dealer he wasn't buying the KIH Magnum they'd been discussing for 6 weeks. The tractor sat on the lot with 305 horsepower, a price tag of $142,000, and financing terms that would have kept Harold current with what everyone else was doing. He'd driven past it 11 times. He'd sat in the cab twice. He'd even brought his son David out to see it on a Saturday morning when the lot was closed. But that Thursday afternoon in March, Harold told Jim Kemper he was taking his 1979 Case IH 2594 to a machine shop in Ridlin instead, paying $18,000 to rebuild the engine for the third time, and farming another 5 years the way he'd always farmed. Jim Kemper didn't argue. He just wrote down the decision in his ledger and moved on to the next appointment. Harold drove home in a 17-year-old tractor that would never make 200 horsepower again, and he didn't tell his wife what the choice might cost them. The farm was 880 acres, corn and soybeans, flat ground, good drainage, no livestock. Harold had bought the Case IH 2594 new in 1979 for $48,000, which was more than his father thought anyone should pay for a tractor. But Harold believed in horsepower you could understand. The 2594 had a turbocharged inline-six engine, mechanical injection, and no computers. When something broke, Harold could see it, touch it, and most of the time, fix it himself. He'd rebuilt the engine in 1987 after a cylinder head cracked during harvest. He'd rebuilt it again in 1992 after a bearing failure that everyone said was bad luck. By 1996, the tractor had 9,100 hours on it, and the engine was burning oil again. Harold knew what that meant. He could spend $142,000 on a new Case IH Magnum with electronics he didn't trust, or he could spend $18,000 on an engine he'd already rebuilt twice. The math wasn't complicated, but the future was. If you've watched this kind of decision play out across decades, if you've seen what happens when a farmer chooses the machine he knows over the machine the market wants, subscribe to this channel. These stories don't rush toward answers. They follow the long consequences of quiet choices made in dealer lots and machine sheds across the rural Midwest. This is about what equipment decisions cost over time and what they reveal about the men who made them. Subscribe, and we'll continue. Harold's father, Gene Dietrich, had farmed the same 880 acres with 2 tractors his entire career, a 1956 Farmall 400 and a 1968 Case 1030, both under 100 horsepower, both paid off within 4 years of purchase. Gene believed debt was the only thing that could take a farm faster than weather. He told Harold that twice a year, every year, from the time Harold was 12 until Gene died in 1981. Harold inherited the farm, sold both of his father's tractors at auction, and bought the Case IH 2594 with a 10-year note at 13.5% interest. It was 1979. Inflation was eating savings, fuel was expensive, but land was producing, and Harold believed the new generation of turbocharged tractors would let him farm alone without hired help. He was right about that. The 2594 pulled a 6-bottom plow and a 30-foot disc without complaint. Harold worked 12-hour days through planting and harvest, and he didn't need anyone else in the cab. By 1984, the tractor was paid off. By 1989, Harold had saved $67,000 in a savings account that earned 8% interest. He could have bought land, he could have upgraded equipment. He did neither. He rebuilt the tractor in 1987, kept farming, and believed that staying small and mechanical was the same as staying safe. But 1996 wasn't 1979. The farmers around Harold were leasing new Case IH Magnum tractors with 250 to 300 horsepower and using them to farm 2,000 to 3,500 acres. They were pulling 12-row planters and 40-foot cultivators. They were covering ground twice as fast as Harold, and they were doing it with air-conditioned cabs, GPS guidance systems, and dealer service contracts that kept them in the field when something broke. Harold's neighbor to the west, Roger Einfeld, had leased a Case IH Magnum 8920 in 1994 and added 600 acres to his operation within 2 years. Roger told Harold the lease payment was $2,100 a month, but the additional income from the extra acres paid for it, and then some. He said the new tractor never broke down, never burned oil, and never made him wonder if he'd finish planting on time. Harold listened, nodded, and kept driving the 2594. He told Roger that leasing was just another word for renting, and renting meant you'd never own anything. Roger didn't argue. He just kept planting, and by 1998, he was farming 2,800 acres. Harold took the 2594 to Reedland in April of 1996. The machine shop pulled the engine, rebuilt the block, replaced the pistons, reground the crank, and had it running again in 6 weeks. Harold paid $18,400, which was $400 more than the estimate. He drove the tractor home, hooked up his 6-bottom plow, and started spring field work 3 weeks behind schedule. The engine ran smooth, the turbo spooled clean. The tractor pulled like it was 1979 again. Harold told his wife, Linda, that he'd just bought himself 5 more years without a payment. Linda didn't say anything. She'd heard that before. David Dietrich was 28 years old in 1996. He'd worked on the farm since he was 14, and he'd been full-time since college. He knew every field, every tile line, every fence corner. He also knew the 2594 was older than he was, and he didn't believe it had 5 more years in it. David had spent time on Roger Einfeldt's farm, riding in the Magnum 8920 during planting. He'd felt the power, the cab comfort, the confidence of knowing the tractor wouldn't quit in the middle of a field. He'd also seen Roger's operation grow while his own family's 880 acres stayed the same. David didn't push his father, but he started doing math in a notebook he kept in the machine shed. He wrote down what it would cost to lease a newer KIH Magnum. He wrote down what it would cost to rent an additional 400 acres. He wrote down what corn at $2.60 a bushel and beans at 6 to 80 cents would generate in revenue. The numbers worked, but his father had made a decision, and David wasn't going to fight him on it. The 2594 ran well through 1996. Harold planted 440 acres of corn and 440 acres of beans. He used a 6-row planter and finished in 14 days, which was longer than it used to take, but still within the window. Harvest was clean. Yields were average. The farm grossed $312,000, and after expenses, Harold cleared $78,000. He put $40,000 into savings and kept the rest for operating cash. The tractor burned a quart of oil every 8 hours, but that was manageable. Harold told David it was a good year, and David agreed. But David also noticed that Roger Einfeldt had harvested 2,800 acres in the same weather, with the same market, and probably cleared $180,000. Roger was 56 years old, 2 years older than Harold, and he was building equity faster than Harold was building savings. In 1997, Harold's clutch started slipping. The tractor had 9,800 hours on it, and the clutch was original. Harold took it back to Reedland in March, and the shop replaced the clutch, pressure plate, and throwout bearing for $4,100. The tractor was down for 10 days. Harold rented a smaller Case IH tractor from Kemper Implements for $150 a day to keep planting on schedule. That cost him $1,500. By the time the 2594 was back in the field, Harold had spent $5,600 on a tractor that was now 18 years old. He didn't mention it to Linda. He just kept working. The summer was dry. Corn yielded 148 bushels per acre instead of the expected 165. Beans were better, but not enough to cover the shortfall. The farm grossed $285,000. Harold cleared $62,000. He put $30,000 into savings and used the rest for operating costs. The 2594 ran through harvest without trouble, but Harold started checking the oil twice a day instead of once. By 1998, David was 30 years old, and he was watching neighbors his age take over family farms with modern equipment and aggressive expansion plans. Tom Rage, who was David's age, had taken over his father's farm in 1996 and immediately leased 2 new Case IH Magnum tractors. Tom was farming 3,100 acres by 1998, and he was talking about adding another 800. David asked his father if they should consider renting more ground. Harold said no. He said 880 acres was what the family had always farmed, and it was enough if you didn't owe anyone. David didn't argue, but he started spending more time in town, talking to other farmers at the co-op and the grain elevator. He heard the same thing from everyone. If you weren't growing, you were dying. If you weren't updating equipment, you were falling behind. If you weren't leveraging debt to increase production, you were farming like it was 1975. David believed them, but his father didn't. In 1999, the hydraulic pump on the 2594 failed during fall tillage. Harold was disking a field when the pump seized, and the tractor lost all hydraulic pressure. He had it towed back to Ridlin, and the shop diagnosed a bearing failure inside the pump. The replacement cost $3,200, and the tractor was down for a week. Harold finished fall work 3 weeks late, which pushed him into wet conditions. He got stuck twice, both times in the same field, and had to pay Roger Einfeld $500 to pull him out with the Magnum 8920. Harold didn't talk about it. He just fixed the pump, finished the work, and parked the tractor for winter. That year, the farm grossed $298,000. Harold cleared $71,000. He put $35,000 into savings, but he'd also spent $3,200 on the hydraulic pump, $1,500 on 2 clutch adjustments, and $800 on miscellaneous repairs. The 2594 now had 11,200 hours on it, and Harold was starting to wonder if 5 years had been realistic. The year 2000 was dry. Corn averaged 142 bushels per acre. Beans averaged 38. It was the worst year Harold had seen since 1988. The farm grossed $267,000. After expenses, Harold cleared $53,000. He put $20,000 into savings, but he also pulled $12,000 out to cover a property tax increase and a new well pump for the house. The savings account, which had peaked at $107,000 in 1998, was now at $115,000. Harold was 58 years old. He'd been farming for 35 years. He'd rebuilt the same tractor 3 times. And he was starting to understand that the decision he'd made in 1996 wasn't about 5 years. It was about whether he'd farm long enough to retire, or whether he'd farm until the equipment quit and the savings ran out. David got married in 2001. His wife, Emily, was from a farm family near Nashua. Her father farmed 1,800 acres with 2 newer KIH Magnum tractors, and he'd been profitable every year since 1995. Emily had grown up watching modern equipment work efficiently, and she didn't understand why Harold was still farming with a tractor older than David. She asked David about it once, carefully, and David told her his father believed in paying cash and avoiding debt. Emily didn't push, but she also didn't think that strategy was working. David and Emily moved into a house in town, and David kept working on the farm. He was 33 years old, and he still didn't own anything. In 2002, the 2594 started losing power under load. Harold noticed it during spring planting. The tractor would pull fine on flat ground, but on any incline it would bog down and struggle. He took it back to Riedlin, and the shop found low compression in 2 cylinders. The engine had 12,400 hours on it, and it was wearing out again. The shop gave Harold 2 options: rebuild the engine again for $22,000 or replace the tractor. Harold asked how long a 4th rebuild would last. The shop foreman, a man named Carl Benson, told him honestly that it might make 2,000 hours or it might make 500. There was no way to know. The block was old, the crank was old, the entire tractor was old. Carl told Harold that at some point, rebuilding an engine wasn't maintenance anymore. It was hope. Harold drove home without making a decision. He talked to Linda that night, and Linda told him what she'd been thinking for 6 years. It was time to let the tractor go. Harold didn't answer. He just went to bed. The next morning, Harold called Kemper Implements and asked Jim Kemper what a used Case IH Magnum would cost. Jim told him there was a 2000 Case IH MX240 on the lot with 100 hours, 240 horsepower, and a price of $98,000. Harold asked what his 2594 was worth on trade. Jim was quiet for a moment, then said $4,500, maybe $5,000 if he was generous. Harold thanked him and hung up. He sat in the kitchen for an hour, staring at the coffee pot. Then he called Riedlin and told Carl to rebuild the engine. He paid $22,000 in June of 2002, and the tractor was back in the field by July. Harold was 60 years old. The savings account was at $93,000, and he was now farming with a tractor that had been rebuilt 4 times. David didn't say anything when the tractor came back from Redland, but he stopped writing numbers in his notebook. He stopped asking about renting more ground. He stopped talking about what other farmers were doing. He just showed up every morning, drove the equipment he was given, and went home at night. Emily asked him once if he was planning to take over the farm. David told her he didn't know. Emily asked what that meant. David said it meant his father was farming with a 23-year-old tractor that had been rebuilt 4 times, and he didn't know if there'd be anything left to take over. Emily didn't ask again. The 2594 ran through 2003 and 2004 without major issues. Harold babied it. He checked the oil every 4 hours. He kept the RPMs low. He avoided heavy loads. The tractor pulled, but slower than it used to. Planting took longer. Tillage took longer. Harvest took longer, but it ran. The farm grossed $289,000 in 2003 and $301,000 in 2004. Harold cleared an average of $68,000 each year. He put money into savings, but he also spent $4,800 on repairs in 2003 and $6,200 in 2004. The savings account stayed around $95,000. Harold was 62 years old in 2004, and he was starting to talk about retiring at 67. David was 36, and he was starting to talk about leaving. In 2005, Roger Einfeld retired. He was 63 years old, and he'd been farming 3,200 acres with 3 KIH Magnum tractors, all leased through Kemper Implements. Roger sold his land, equipment, and remaining lease contracts to a farm management company out of Cedar Falls. The sale price wasn't public, but people at the co-op said Roger walked away with enough to buy a house in Arizona and never worry about money again. Harold went to Roger's retirement party at the Legion Hall in Waterloo. Roger told Harold it had been a good run, and Harold agreed. Roger asked Harold when he was planning to retire. Harold said 5 years, maybe sooner. Roger nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Harold drove home that night, thinking about the difference between leasing 3 modern Case IH tractors and rebuilding one old one 4 times. He didn't talk about it, but he thought about it. In 2006, the starter on the 2594 failed. Harold replaced it himself for $340. In 2007, the alternator failed. Harold replaced it for $280. In 2008, the water pump failed. Harold replaced it for $190. In 2009, the fuel lift pump failed. Harold replaced it for $420. Every year, something small broke. Every year, Harold fixed it. Every year, the tractor got older. By 2010, the 2594 had 14,600 hours on it. Harold was 68 years old. He'd been planning to retire at 67, but he was still farming. David was 42, married with 2 kids, and still working on the farm without ownership, without equity, and without a plan. Emily had stopped asking about the future. She just accepted that David would work for his father until his father stopped, and nobody knew when that would be. In 2011, David's younger brother, Jason, who'd left the farm in 1999 to work as an electrician in Dubuque, came home for Thanksgiving. Jason walked through the machine shed, looked at the 2594, and asked Harold why he was still farming with it. Harold said because it still ran. Jason asked what it was worth. Harold said maybe $3,000 at auction, maybe less. Jason asked what a newer Case IH Magnum was worth. Harold said $120,000 to $160,000, depending on hours and model year. Jason asked how Harold planned to retire if he didn't have equipment to sell. Harold didn't answer. Jason went back to Dubuque the next day, and Harold never brought it up again. The 2594 started burning oil again in 2012, a quart every 6 hours, then a quart every 4 hours. By September of 2013, it was a quart every 2 hours. Harold knew what that meant. The rings were gone, the cylinders were worn, the engine was dying for the 5th time. He didn't take it to Reedland. He didn't call Kemper Implements. He just kept adding oil and kept working. On October 18, 2013, during corn harvest, the engine seized in the middle of a field. Harold was pulling a 4-row corn head and the tractor just stopped. No warning, no noise, just stopped. Harold sat in the cab for 20 minutes staring at the instrument panel. Then he climbed down, walked back to the truck, and called David. David came out with a service truck, looked at the tractor, and asked his father what he wanted to do. Harold said, "Leave it." David asked for how long. Harold said he didn't know. They left the tractor in the field, and Harold rented a newer KIH tractor from Kemper Implements to finish harvest. The rental cost $4,800 for 3 weeks. Harold was 71 years old. The 2594 had 15,100 hours on it, and it would never run again. In December of 2013, Harold listed the farm for sale. 880 acres, house, machine shed, and equipment. The land sold in February of 2014 for $1.6 million. Harold kept the house and sold everything else. The equipment went to auction in March. The 25 and 94 sold for $2,100 to a salvage dealer who wanted it for parts. Harold's other equipment, including a 1998 Case IH planter and a 1985 International disc, sold for a combined $18,000. After the sale, David took a job managing a 4,200-acre farm operation near Jesup. The farm used 6 modern Case IH Magnum tractors, all maintained under dealer service contracts. David made $68,000 a year, plus bonuses, and he had health insurance for the first time since 2001. He bought a house in town. He coached his son's baseball team. He stopped talking about the 25 and 94, but he thought about it. He thought about what the farm could have been if his father had made a different decision in 1996. He thought about what 880 acres could have grown into if his father had leased a Magnum, rented more ground, and built equity instead of rebuilding engines. He thought about the $2,100 the 25 and 94 sold for at auction, and the $142,000 his father refused to spend. And he understood that his father had made the decision he believed was safe, and it had cost David the one thing he'd wanted: a farm. Harold died in 2021 at the age of 79. Linda is still alive, living in the house on what used to be the farm. David visits once a month. He doesn't farm anymore. He manages other people's operations, and he's good at it. But he's not a farmer. Not the way his father was. Not the way his grandfather was. The land David grew up working is now part of a 6,800-acre operation run by a farm management company that leases equipment, hires operators, and monitors every field with GPS and yield data. The 2594 was parted out in 2014. The engine block was scrapped. The sheet metal was sold. The tires were resold. Nothing remains except the serial number in a Case IH database somewhere, showing that in 1979, a farmer in Iowa bought a tractor for $48,000 and believed it would last forever. It lasted 34 years. But what it cost in the end wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in what didn't happen. The acres not rented, the equipment not upgraded, the operation not expanded, the son not farming. Harold Dietrich made a choice in 1996. He chose the machine he understood over the machine the market wanted. He chose control over growth. He chose mechanical simplicity over modern power. And for 17 years that choice held. The 2594 ran, the farm produced, the bills were paid. But farming isn't just about surviving season to season, it's about what you leave behind. And when Harold sold the farm in 2014, he left behind $1.43 million in a managed account and a son who would never own land. The tractor that was supposed to last 5 more years lasted 17. But it never built anything. It just ran until it didn't. And when it stopped, there was nothing left to sell but parts.